Cocky new attorney humiliates old lady. Gets the shock of his life in courtroom. The sharp click of polished shoes echoed through the marble hallway. He adjusted his silk tie, glanced once more in the mirror, and smirked. At just 32, he was the youngest partner at one of the most powerful law firms in the city. And today, he was here to crush another case. He walked like he owned the courthouse, head high, shoulders back. Confidence poured off him like expensive cologne. "Open and shut," he whispered to himself, gripping his briefcase. He was defending a group of police officers in a case that, to him, felt like just another noise, another grieving family trying to cash in. Then he saw her. Sitting quietly at the end of the courtroom bench was an elderly black woman. She wore a simple navy blue suit. Her silver hair was neatly pulled back. She looked more like someone's grandmother than a lawyer. He chuckled under his breath and turned to a reporter nearby. "That's who they sent?" "She looks like she should be knitting, not arguing in court." The reporter gave a polite smile but didn't respond. The older woman said nothing. She didn't flinch. She just sat there, flipping gently through her notes with the calm of someone who'd done this many times before. He leaned toward her and said low, "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right courtroom?" She looked up at him slowly, met his eyes with a small smile, and replied, "Don't worry, son. I've been in the right place longer than you've been wearing that fancy suit." He scoffed and walked to his side of the room, already writing her off in his mind. The courtroom began to fill. On one side sat police officers in full uniform, their faces tight and unreadable. On the other, a quiet mother and her daughter held hands. They looked like they hadn't slept in days. The older woman stood and walked over to them, placing a hand gently on the mother's shoulder. It was a small moment, but you could feel the weight of it, comfort without words. When the judge entered, the room stood. Even he paused when his eyes landed on the elderly woman. His jaw tightened just slightly. He knew her. The young attorney didn't notice. He was already flipping through his notes, ready to tear the case apart. As the court settled, he stood confidently, introduced himself, and laid out the defense. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this is a tragic situation, but not because of wrongdoing. No, it's tragic because a good officer did his job, and now the department is under attack by emotional people looking for someone to blame." His voice was strong, polished, rehearsed. He spoke like someone who believed every word, or at least knew how to sound like he did. When he finished, he smiled at the jury like he'd already won. Then it was her turn. The older woman rose slowly. No drama, no raised voice. Just calm. "My name is, and I represent the family of Terrence Wallace, a young man who never made it home." Her voice was soft, but the room leaned in. He was 26. He worked 2 jobs. He helped his sister through school. He had no criminal record. He wasn't a threat. But he died with his hands up and his name already buried under assumptions. She didn't need to shout. Her words carried more weight than the loudest voice could. Even the jury was still. Even the young attorney stopped flipping his pen. "And while you'll hear about procedures and policies," she continued, "I ask you to remember this isn't about paperwork. It's about people. A son, a brother, a life." The room went silent. Even the judge, normally unreadable, watched her with something close to respect. The young lawyer shifted in his seat for the first time that day. He didn't know it yet, but this case wouldn't make his career. It might break it. And the woman he had mocked? She wasn't here for a win. She was here for something bigger, something stronger than pride. She was here for justice. The courtroom emptied for recess, but that silence, the kind that hung heavy after something important was said, still followed everyone out the doors. The young attorney, however, didn't notice. He was too busy on his phone, bragging to a colleague. "She gave a cute little speech," he scoffed. "Real moving, But speeches don't win cases. Evidence does. And trust me, she doesn't have it. He said it with such certainty. But across town, in a modest 2-bedroom home, there were things worth more than any piece of evidence. The house was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of quiet that feels thick, still, like grief lived in the walls. Margaret Wallace stood by the kitchen window, staring out at the tiny garden her son used to help her with. Her hands were wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, but the coffee had long gone cold. She wasn't really drinking it. She just needed something to hold on to. In the living room, her daughter Lisa sat on the couch, flipping through a photo album. She wasn't really looking at the pictures either. Her eyes kept stopping on the same page, Terrence in his graduation gown, smiling like he had the whole world ahead of him. "Mom," Lisa said softly, "you sure we're doing the right thing? I mean, it's the whole police department. They're powerful. People are saying terrible things about Terrence." Margaret didn't answer right away. She just walked over, sat beside her daughter, and stared at that same photo. Then she placed her hand over it. Her fingers gently traced the edge of his cap in the picture. "Your brother was many things," she said. "But a criminal wasn't one of them. He was kind. Too kind sometimes. He helped old folks take groceries to their car. He stayed late, at work just to cover someone else's shift. And when he saw someone in trouble, he never looked away." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "He used to bring me those awful fake flowers from the dollar store," she laughed through it. "Said it was to brighten the day, even on my worst days." Margaret smiled, but it faded quickly. "They took that boy from us, and now they're trying to bury who he really was with headlines and lies. But I won't let that happen. Not while I'm still breathing." Just then there was a knock at the door. Margaret stood, smoothed her dress, and opened it to reveal the woman who had stood tall and silent in that courtroom only hours ago. She didn't come with a camera crew. No flash, no headlines. Just a worn leather bag and tired eyes that had seen too many stories just like this. "Eleanor," Margaret said, letting her in. "Come in. We were just talking about Terrence." Eleanor stepped inside, looking around the humble home. She noticed the photos, the Bible on the end table, the broken frame on the shelf that someone hadn't had the heart to throw away. "Mrs. Wallace, Lisa," she greeted them, her voice warm but firm. "Before we head back to court, I need you both to know something. This case won't be easy. The other side will twist everything. They'll pull up old school reports, friends he had, mistakes he made, anything they can to turn this trial into a circus." Lisa sat up straighter. "Why would they do that?" "Because it's easier to attack someone's past than face the truth about the present," Eleanor replied. "But we have something stronger. We have his story. And your love for him. That's not something they can erase." Margaret nodded. "We're not backing down." Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a single photo, a printed still frame from security footage. "There's a reason they lost the body cam footage. And I'm starting to believe it wasn't an accident. Someone saw something. And they don't want the world to know." She folded the photo and slid it back into her folder. "This isn't just about Terrence anymore. It's about a system that's been getting away with too much for too long." The three women sat in silence, for a moment, letting it settle. Then Lisa whispered, "He used to say, 'Be brave, sis. Truth's only scary to people who lie.'" Margaret reached over and took her daughter's hand. "Then let's go speak the truth." As they gathered their things and stepped out into the fading sunlight, there was no cheering crowd, no heroes. Welcome. Just three women walking into a storm, holding on to each other, and behind them, a home still filled with grief, but now also filled with something stronger. A reason to fight, a reason to believe, a reason to finish what Terrence started. The next morning, the courthouse steps were no longer just stone and concrete. They had become a dividing line. On one side, reporters packed shoulder to shoulder, microphones raised like weapons. On the other, protesters held signs high. Some called for justice. Others shouted back in defense of the officers. Voices clashed. Emotions flared. Police formed a quiet wall between them, eyes forward, unmoving. Inside, it was calmer, but the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the quiet before something heavy hit. The young lawyer, dressed in another expensive suit, strutted past the crowd as if none of it applied to him. As if the shouting outside didn't concern him, and the trial was already over. "Courtroom theater," he muttered, barely looking up from his phone. Everyone loves a show. He made his way to the defense table, surrounded by folders that looked thick but felt empty. He had confidence, swagger, and just enough arrogance to believe he still had the upper hand. On the other side of the room, Eleanor sat beside Margaret and Lisa, calmly adjusting her glasses. She didn't speak much. She didn't need to. Her presence had already begun to change something in the room. Quiet power had a way of doing that. The judge entered. Everyone stood, and just like that, it began. The young lawyer's voice cut through the room first. Smooth, sharp, carefully trained. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, walking with ease in front of them. "You're going to hear a lot about emotions in this case, about feelings, about loss. But this courtroom deals in facts, not feelings. We don't convict good officers based on tears. We follow the evidence." He made it sound simple, cold, clean. He turned toward the jury. "And the evidence will show that on the night in question, Officer Miller followed procedure. He responded to a threat. He didn't go looking for trouble. Trouble came to him." Then, with a theatrical pause, he gestured toward Margaret. "You will hear testimony from grieving family members, and I respect that grief. But grief doesn't equal guilt. This is not a trial about pain. This is about protocol, policy, and law." He sat down with a satisfied look, confident, certain he'd made his point. Then Eleanor stood. She didn't pace. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't act like she was putting on a show. She just looked the jury in the eye, one by one. "Terrence Wallace was not a threat," she said simply. "He was a young man walking home from work. He had a phone in one hand and ice cream in the other." She paused, letting that image settle. He wasn't armed. He didn't run. He didn't resist. What he did do was record. The courtroom held its breath. "And that," she said, "was the real threat." She turned slightly, her gaze resting on the row of officers sitting behind the defense table. Uniforms crisp, expressions unreadable. Ask yourself, why does the body cam footage always go missing when it matters most? Why is it always the same officers whose cameras malfunction? Why is the system built to protect them, even when the truth is clear? She stepped back to her table. "This isn't about tearing down the law. It's about protecting it. Because the law doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to all of us." The judge nodded slightly. A small gesture, but it didn't go unnoticed. Court continued. Witnesses were called. The officers told their version, measured, controlled, polished. They spoke of a tense situation, a misunderstanding, a sudden movement. But something was missing from their words. Something human. Outside, the protests grew louder. Inside, something began to shift. Even some jurors started to lean forward more when Eleanor spoke. The young lawyer noticed. He didn't say anything, but the tapping of his pen got faster. During a recess, he approached Eleanor in the hallway, alone. "You think calm words and sad eyes are going to win this?" he asked, his tone low and sharp. "I've beaten better lawyers than you." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "That's the difference between us," she said. "You came here to win. I came here to tell the truth." She walked away without another word. Back in the courtroom, A new witness was called, a woman who had worked at the same grocery store as Terrence. She was nervous, hands trembling, but her voice, when it came, was steady. He was a good kid, she said. Never late, never caused trouble, always made sure the older workers got their breaks. The young lawyer tried to rattle her, asking about Terrence's friends, whether he'd ever been in trouble at school. No, she said, looking straight at him. He wasn't perfect, but he was good. That night, as the courtroom lights dimmed and people filed out, Margaret walked slowly down the courthouse steps. Eleanor walked beside her, quiet. "How do you think it's going?" Margaret asked. Eleanor looked out at the flashing cameras, the shouting voices, the signs in the air. "I think the truth is starting to make some noise." And in the shadows of that towering courthouse, you could almost feel it. The beginning of something breaking open. Not just the case, but the silence that had covered stories like Terrence's for far too long. The courtroom felt different the next day, not louder, not busier, just heavier. Word had gotten out, not just about the case, but about the woman leading it. Some of the reporters now pointed their cameras at Eleanor when she walked in, but she ignored them. Her steps were slow, deliberate, like someone who had carried weight before and learned not to rush under it. Margaret and Lisa were already seated, holding hands, their faces calm but pale. They had barely slept. The night before, a neighbor had warned them that people were starting to talk. Ugly things. Rumors. Lies. The kind that get whispered when the truth feels too hard to swallow. But they came anyway. Because this wasn't just a case. It was their son. Their truth. As the bailiff called the court to order, the young lawyer leaned over to his team and smirked. "She's starting to get attention," he whispered. "Good. That just means more pressure. Let's see if she cracks." But it wasn't Eleanor who was feeling the pressure. It was the courtroom. She rose from her seat as the next witness was called. A retired teacher who had known Terrence since he was in elementary school. "He was quiet," she said softly, adjusting her glasses. "But always first to volunteer. Always the one who stayed behind to help stack chairs after class." The young lawyer rose to cross-examine. "Ma'am, with respect, you haven't taught him since he was a child," he said. "Would you say your memory might be influenced by time or emotion?" The teacher looked at him steadily. "Time changes. Some things," she said, "but not the way I remember that boy's heart." A few people in the gallery nodded. The judge didn't react, but he was listening closely now. He hadn't missed the change either. Eleanor stood once again. She didn't walk around. She didn't pace like her opponent did. She stayed still, anchored. "The defense wants you to believe this case is about emotion," she said, eyes on the jury, as if grief somehow clouds the truth. But grief doesn't make people lie. Grief makes people brave. The courtroom stayed silent, but even the officer sitting at the defense table shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Terrence Wallace didn't die because someone made a mistake," Eleanor continued. "He died because someone made a choice, and now they want to bury that choice under rules and reports." She placed a printed document on the table in front of her. "This is the incident report," she said. "It's clean, too clean. It doesn't mention the broken phone found near his body. It doesn't explain why 3 security cameras near the scene were suddenly offline. It doesn't account for the 4-minute gap in the radio log." She looked up again. 4 minutes, she said. "That's a long time when someone's begging for their life." The defense objected, of course. "Speculation," the young lawyer snapped. "Sustained," said the judge, but his voice lacked bite. Later that afternoon, the jury listened to the 911 call. It had been suppressed for weeks, but was now part of the record. In it, a passerby's shaky voice could be heard. "There's a man on the ground." The cops are yelling at him, but he's not moving. I think he's hurt. They're still shouting. Please, someone needs to come. The recording cut off before the sirens arrived. No one looked more uncomfortable during that playback than the officers on the defense team. Their once proud posture was fading. And the young lawyer? He looked rattled. Not publicly, not completely, but the cracks were there. He dropped his pen twice that afternoon, fumbled a page during his closing, remarks for the day. And when he caught Eleanor's eye across the room, he didn't smirk this time. He just looked away. Outside, the crowd had doubled. There were people handing out flyers with Terrence's photo on them, others with signs saying, "We see you. We hear you." Margaret saw them through the window and wiped her eyes. "He's still speaking," she whispered. "Even now." Eleanor stood beside her, quiet, watching. She didn't speak often between sessions. She liked to sit with the family, not as a lawyer, but as someone who understood that grief didn't need to be filled with words. Sometimes, presence was enough. Lisa sat beside her mother, holding the broken phone case they'd kept since the night Terrence died. "Do you think they'll ever see him the way we did?" she asked quietly. Eleanor turned to her. "They will," she said. "Maybe not all at once. Maybe not even right away. But when the truth rises, and it always does, it changes people. And once they see it, they can't unsee it." That night, as the court recessed for the day, the young lawyer walked alone to his car. His phone buzzed. It was his senior partner. "Be careful," the voice said. "She's building something in there. You better have something stronger than confidence." He didn't answer. For the first time, he wasn't so sure. Because that old woman he had mocked? She wasn't just building a case. She was building a reckoning. 2 days later, the courtroom was buzzing before the judge even entered. Rumors had started swirling the night before. Whispers about new evidence, about someone coming forward. No one knew exactly what, or who, but you could feel it in the air. The young attorney noticed it too. He walked into court that morning like usual, back straight, jaw tight. But this time, he wasn't early. He didn't greet reporters like he had before. He didn't crack jokes at the water cooler. He just kept checking his phone, again and again, as if he was waiting for something, or someone. And then the door opened. Man in plain clothes stepped in, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. He looked nervous, sweating through his collar. The entire courtroom turned as he walked down the aisle, but Eleanor didn't look surprised. She stood slowly and said, "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Officer Raymond to the stand." The young attorney froze. Just for a moment. Raymond. A name he'd heard in internal memos, a name they told him was not a risk. The courtroom murmured as the officer was sworn in. He cleared his throat and gripped the edges of the witness stand like it was the only thing holding him up. "I was part of the unit on the night Terrence Wallace died," he began. "I wasn't at the scene, but I saw the report come in." He glanced at Eleanor, who gave him a small, steady nod. No pressure, just presence. I kept my mouth shut," he admitted, "because that's what you're supposed to do. You don't question the chain of command. You don't push when the report's already written." He paused. His hands trembled slightly. "But I saw the footage, the real footage, from the dash cam." The courtroom gasped. The young attorney jumped to his feet. "Objection. This footage was never entered into discovery. The officer is..." Eleanor's voice cut in, calm but firm. "That's because it was deleted. At least, the version the defense received was." The judge leaned forward. "Explain." The officer nodded slowly, like each word was a weight on his tongue. "There's a system we use, body cam, dash cam, building security feeds. All of it gets backed up. And sometimes, well, files don't match. I checked the original logs. The time codes didn't add up. I thought maybe it was a glitch. He stopped, but it wasn't. Eleanor stepped closer, holding a printed screenshot. This frame, she said, was recovered from the server logs. It shows Officer Miller standing over Terrence's body, after the use of force was already applied. The jury leaned in. The photo was grainy, but clear enough. Eleanor continued. In his hand is a phone, Terrence's phone, the one that disappeared from evidence, the one that might have recorded everything. The judge turned to the witness. Officer, did you report this? He nodded. I tried. I sent an email, made a backup copy. A few days later, I got reassigned, told to take a leave. Internal affairs never followed up. Eleanor placed the email on the evidence screen. The timestamp was 3 days after Terrence's death. The young attorney stood, looking pale. He shuffled his papers, trying to regain footing. Your Honor? He said, this is speculative at best. No, Eleanor said gently. It's a pattern, and now it's a fact. That afternoon, Eleanor called another witness, a city records clerk. Quiet, nervous, clearly not used to being in court. But when she opened the folder in her hands, the room stilled again. These are property development records, she said, linked to the same neighborhood where Terrence was stopped. They show plans for a new private housing project and a sudden spike in arrests just months before. She looked up. They were clearing the area. Outside, the protests had shifted. Now people weren't just holding signs for Terrence. They were holding signs for other names, other faces. Some old, some recent. One sign simply read, "We've been telling you." The young attorney sat quietly. Now, the confidence that once clung to him had started peeling away, one layer at a time. In the hallway later, he approached Eleanor. "What is this to you?" he asked, his voice low. "You already had a legacy. Why take on a fight that could destroy your name?" She looked at him, not with anger, but with something else. Something that almost resembled sadness. "Because I've buried too many kids I never got to represent," she said. "Because for some of us, the fight doesn't end when we retire. It ends when justice stops needing a lawyer." He stared at her, speechless. "Don't worry," she added softly. "I'm not here to destroy you. That part, you're doing all on your own." That evening, back in her small home office, Eleanor sat in the same wooden chair she had used for decades. Files surrounded her, handwritten notes everywhere. But what caught her eye was an old letter from years ago, one written by a boy named Terrence Wallace, sent to her clinic in high school after attending one of her community talks. It simply said, "I want to help people like you do, not with power, with truth." She held the letter gently and smiled, because now he was helping, even in silence, even in death. His truth was rising, and the system that tried to bury it was finally being forced to look down and dig it back up. The courtroom was no longer a place for whispers. It had become something else, a reckoning. The next morning, the courtroom benches filled faster than ever. Reporters pressed together shoulder to shoulder. Community members showed up hours early. Some brought signs, others just brought presents. A quiet determination had replaced the outrage. No one came to be loud. They came to bear witness. Inside, Eleanor sat calmly at the prosecution table, her hands folded neatly, waiting. Margaret and Lisa sat behind her. Lisa was holding a folded piece of paper, Terrence's last college essay. She hadn't let go of it in days. Across the room, the young attorney looked like a man trapped in his own reflection. His suit was still clean, his tie perfectly straight. But his eyes were different now. They didn't dart around the room looking for an opportunity. They stayed fixed on his notes. Like maybe if he kept looking down, the world wouldn't see he was cracking, and he was cracking. Because yesterday, the truth got a name. Officer Raymond's testimony had rattled more than just the courtroom. It had rippled through the department, through the press, through the very foundation this case was built on. Today, Eleanor wasn't calling another police officer. She called someone no one expected. The prosecution calls the defense attorney to the stand. A hush swept across the room. The judge looked up, eyebrows raised. "Objection," the new defense lawyer snapped. Ethan, the young attorney, looked like he'd been hit in the chest. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Brooks, you are no longer lead counsel. The court has accepted your withdrawal after the conflict of interest motion yesterday. You've been subpoenaed. Please take the stand." His hands trembled slightly as he walked to the witness box. His mouth tightened. His pride tried to follow, but it couldn't quite keep up anymore. Eleanor stood, holding a small, slim folder. "Mr. Brooks," she began, "did you receive these internal memos from the police department?" He glanced at the papers, then nodded. "Yes." "Did you advise the officers involved to withhold the original body cam footage?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at Margaret, at Lisa, then at the floor. "I didn't stop them," he said. The courtroom held still. "And why not?" Eleanor asked. He looked up at her, and for the first time since the trial began, his voice didn't carry confidence. "Because I was told it wasn't my job to care about the details. Just win. That's what we were paid for." There it was. The thing nobody says out loud. "And now?" Eleanor asked. "Is it still not your job to care?" He swallowed hard. "I didn't know how far it went," he said. "Not at first, but I saw the cracks, the files that disappeared, the witnesses who were pushed out. I knew. I just didn't want to be the one to lose everything." "Mr. Brooks," Eleanor asked gently, "do you believe Terrence Wallace was murdered?" He looked at Lisa again, then Margaret. Then he said it. "Yes." Margaret closed her eyes. Not in relief, not in triumph, in pain, because saying it didn't bring her son back. It just confirmed what her heart had been screaming since the moment she saw his body. Eleanor sat back down. No further questions. The new defense lawyer didn't even stand. "No questions, Your Honor." The judge dismissed the witness. Later that day, Eleanor called a forensics expert who had examined Terrence's injuries. She pointed to a diagram on the screen. "These marks," she said, "are not consistent with self-defense. They are consistent with restraint, with someone already subdued." The courtroom listened in silence. Terrence was hit after he was already down, multiple times. The jury looked away. One of the officers in the gallery rose and walked out. The judge called for a recess. Outside in the hallway, reporters swarmed Eleanor. She didn't stop to speak. But Lisa did. Her voice was soft but clear. "We came here for the truth," she said. "And now that it's out, what are you going to do with it?" The reporters didn't respond. But that night, headlines changed. The next morning, protest signs didn't just say "Justice for Terrence." They said "Accountability for all." That evening, in her office, Eleanor received a package. Inside was a USB drive. No name, no return address. Just a note. "There's more, and we're done being silent." She plugged it in. Footage, documents, names. The system was crumbling, not because of one case, but because people had finally decided enough was enough. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep. She sat with Margaret and Lisa, going through the files. Piece by piece, the full story was forming. And tomorrow, it wouldn't just be about Terrence Wallace. It would be about every name that never got a trial. Every mother who was told to stop, asking questions. Every truth buried in a drawer labeled classified. Tomorrow, the silence would end. And the walls, they were already falling. It was the kind of morning where the world felt like it was holding its breath. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was silent. No chants, no shouting, just people standing shoulder to shoulder, waiting. Some held signs, some held photos, others just held each other. Inside, the courtroom felt smaller than usual. The same wood, the same walls, but the air had changed. Even the cameras had gone quiet, as if they too understood that what was about to happen wasn't just a verdict, it was a moment. The jury filed in. 12 faces, all marked by the weight of what they'd seen. The judge, who had stayed steady through it all, looked more human now, tired, like he'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. Margaret sat between Eleanor and Lisa. Her Bible was closed on her lap, her hands pressed over it. Lisa clutched a folded photo of Terrence, the one where he was laughing with his eyes closed, caught mid-laugh. That was how she remembered him best. The clerk stood. Everyone did. Has the jury reached a verdict? A pause. Then the foreman stood. We have, Your Honor. In the matter of the People versus Officer Miller, guilty. In the matter of conspiracy to cover up evidence, guilty. In the matter of obstruction, falsification, and civil rights violations, guilty. And then, like a slow wave, it hit. Not cheers. Not applause, just tears. Quiet ones, deep ones, the kind that live under years of waiting. Lisa broke down first, her shoulders trembling. Margaret didn't cry. She just closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, just to the sky, to her son, to whatever held her upright when she couldn't stand anymore. Officer Miller didn't speak. He didn't look at anyone. The young lawyer, now stripped of the title and the pride he walked in with, sat in the back of the courtroom, watching the trial he started with arrogance, and in truth. The judge didn't deliver a speech. He didn't need to. Instead, he said, "The court finds that justice, though delayed, has not been denied. Sentencing will follow. For now, we let the truth stand." Afterward, reporters flooded the courthouse steps. But Margaret didn't stop for questions. She walked slowly, one arm around Lisa, the other holding Eleanor's hand. They weren't smiling. This wasn't a victory. It was a clearing, a start. That evening, at a small community center nearby, a memorial service was held for Terrence. No suits, no speeches. Just music, candles, food, and faces, lots of faces, gathered to remember a boy who became a name, then a story, and finally, a movement. Eleanor spoke only once that night, not from a podium, just from the middle of the crowd. Justice is not a finish line, she said. It's a direction, a commitment. Terrence gave us the reason. Now we carry the rest. The crowd didn't cheer. They just nodded, because that was enough. Months passed. The police department began a full internal review. Some officers resigned, others came forward. A few started their own paths to rebuilding trust in the very communities they once feared. Lisa graduated nursing school and began working at a trauma center. Her first patient was a boy shot during a protest, and she held his hand while he cried. Margaret started speaking at churches and schools, not as a preacher or a lawyer, just as a mother. A mother who buried her son and still had something to give. And Eleanor? She finally stepped away. Not because she was tired, though she was, but because she knew the torch had been passed. She'd fought long enough to know when it was someone else's turn. She left her office keys with a young public defender, someone who once said she didn't think she was strong enough to face the system. You don't have to be strong every day, Eleanor told her. You just have to be honest. 1 year later, a mural went up outside the courthouse. It showed Terrence, not as a victim, but as a boy holding a phone, shining a light towards something we weren't ready to see. Under it were the words, "You don't lose when you tell the truth." The city didn't become perfect, but it became aware, more watchful, more human. And somewhere, in a quiet home filled with photo frames and sunlight through lace curtains, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, a warm mug in her hand, and whispered. Her son's name, not in pain, but in peace. Because finally, he was more than just a headline. He was heard, he was believed, and he was home.